Uh, I just need to accept the recording. Maybe we could say something on this later also, Chris, or maybe you can. Well, I will just briefly introduce Fabio. Fabio Di Masi is a former member of the European and German parliaments, and Fabio is currently an honorary fellow for digital financial markets and financial crime with the NGO Finanzwende, which I would translate, I don't know how you translate it, Fabio. I would translate it like turn of finances or sea change in finances. And this NGO strives for better regulated financial markets. Fabio played a key role in investigating the scandal around the German payment processing firm Wirecard, as well as various corporate tax and money laundering related scandals. And we invited him today also because we, as researchers on the role of private consultants on policymaking, we frequently benefited from his so-called interpellations to the German federal parliament. For the German-speaking audience, there's not much, but it's kleine und große Anfragen, which it's similar or comparable to freedom of information requests, and these were a great resource for our research. So, Chris, maybe a short sentence. You started a recording of this meeting. The reason is that some people were very interested in the topics of today, but maybe you can say where it will be saved and
yeah, okay. Basically, we've had a few people that have sent their requests that regrets that they're unable to attend today, but they're very interested to see the discussion. So for that reason, I was gonna record the talks, and we'll post this. I think I can post this via the Concordia website. So I'll send folks the link after it has been recorded.
And you will delete it after, let's say, 2 weeks or so. We didn't really agree on it because it's,
yeah. Okay. Maybe we'll just focus on just recording the talks and posting that and leave the discussion out.
Okay, just to be clear on that. So, yes, Richard, would you like to start your presentation? And thanks for being here today, to the both of you, and also to the audience.
Well, Anne, Chris, Fabio, who I've known for some time. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming. Thanks for asking me. I'm going to apologize in advance. As I was explaining to your hosts before we started, I am suffering from long COVID. I'm not, therefore, I would suggest quite the brightest and clearest that I can sometimes be today. I happen to be on a bad day, and it's not fun. But let's talk about my experience. If we go to the first slide, Chris is running, I think, the slides for me, because I find it works better that way. I've been looking at the Big Four for a long time. Let's be honest, I worked in the Big Four. I joined KPMG straight out of university in 1979, only it was called Peat Marwick Mitchell & Co. in those days, in London, and I trained as a chartered accountant there. I'm still a chartered accountant. I've just been told I've been nominated to be the UK Accounting Social Media Influencer of the Year. Yet again, I hold the title for the last 3 years, so I'm hoping I'll get it for the 4th year in a row. My sons are extremely dubious that I hold this award as a social media influencer because they say I don't have a makeup routine and therefore I don't qualify. They do, I don't. So anyway, I'm involved as an accountant very much, and I also find it very odd that the Institute of Chartered Accountants give me this award because I have been such a big critic of them and the Big Four. I'm sure KPMG regret that I trained there and always have done. I've done a lot of work around this area. It started off as, let's be honest, campaigning. I'm an accidental academic in a very real sense. Lots of people write to me as Dr. Murphy. I'm not Dr. Murphy. I don't have a doctorate. I could qualify for one if I bothered to actually do it, because I've published plenty enough papers. But I became an academic because I had done international political economy. And much of that international political economy was the consequence of taking on the Big Four firms. Quite a lot of what I will be saying now will be based upon this particular piece of work. I put up the link there. It's work I did actually in about 2017. It was funded by one of the groups, the GUI group inside the European Parliament, a relatively small piece of work, but which we did vastly more work on. Silas Stalsholm was then a student at Copenhagen Business School, now Dr. Stalsholm. And we looked at the big four firms and where they were. And I think that sort of brought to my mind, the conclusion of a lot of thinking that I'd done over the years about this beast that I was taking on. And the absolute obvious conclusion of that piece of work was that there is, in a literal sense, no such thing as the big four. Look, we can easily name them. They're KPMG, the smallest of them, EY, the third largest, and Deloitte and Pricewaterhouse, who sort of compete on which is the largest one. But there is no such thing as those firms. If you look for them, if you try to find them in a very real sense, they aren't there, because there is no overall controlling organization. They are simply a consortia of international accounting and consulting firms, and there is no common method of control between them. What defines the big four is that they sign up to certain methods of working, so common audit approaches, to some degree common taxation approaches, very much to common marketing systems. You'll find an enormous consistency between their websites and their marketing materials, and to codes of conduct. Yeah, let's move on, Chris. So if you go and look, and we did in this, oops, we're going all over the place. There is no parent company. We went to look at the structure. We particularly analyzed KPMG, but the evidence was very clear that the firms were really quite similar. 3 of the 4 are headed by companies registered in London, which are registered as non-profit firms, which is quite extraordinary. The exception is KPMG, which is registered in Switzerland. It is registered as a cooperative, a Verein, an unusual structure, but available in Switzerland. Again, not for profit. And these are coordinating bodies, which actually simply are there to regulate that these disparate firms around the world are all following broadly similar practices. Now, the immediate and obvious consequence of that is that when you say you're taking on the big four, you're actually got to understand that you're not taking on 4 firms. You can, and I think in the case of KPMG, we recognize that there was something like 125 different controlling bodies who were running KPMGs, some of whom ran KPMGs in several countries. So, for example, some of the small islands in the Caribbean, then, although they're separate jurisdictions, they're actually one firm. KPMG in the Balkans is one firm, but overall, most countries have a separate legal entity, which is KPMG. So we aren't facing entities when we talk about the big four. We're actually talking about brands, and that is something quite different. Can we have the next slide? I have no idea what that one means. We are talking about entities. Our jetties is meant to say entities, but clearly I didn't notice that I've made some big typos there. And I think this is a classical neoliberal construct in a very real sense. That what we've got here are organizations that have been themselves constructed to maximize their return at cost to society. And you have to understand that, I think, if you're going to actually understand what the organization you're taking on is, because they're there to extract privilege, opportunity, and profit for the benefit of those who control these firms. And there are controlling partners. We discovered this in the case of KPMG, for example. Not all of the countries where KPMG is located are represented in actually the KPMG controlling firm. When we looked, we thought there were 58 countries which actually were part of the controlling entities. The rest were basically licensed by the Swiss Verein, but aren't themselves represented. And within the firms, there are, although it's called partnership in many places, of course, they aren't in the legal sense what used to be thought of as partnerships, unlimited liability firms, which was what Peat Marwick Mitchell & Co. was when I joined it. They're almost all protected by limited liability now, most commonly the limited liability partnership, a creation of around the turn of the century. But the members of that aren't all themselves profit-owning partners. Many of them are actually employees, even though they're called partners. And there's a relatively small controlling coterie within each firm, it would seem, each national firm. And those are the people who are extracting the rent here. Now, these are classic rent-seeking organizations, in my opinion, as a result, particularly in the hierarchical sense. Obviously, lower down, there are large numbers of people like I was when I was in this firm, doing the donkey work on the ground, actually doing the audits, doing the tax work and everything else. And I'm not disputing that, of course, there's a real activity that goes on there. But there is a rent-seeking activity, and it's based upon the statutory right to audit. And the simple fact is that most large multinational corporations who form the majority of the client base of these firms are required to have their accounts audited, and they must be audited by a regulated firm. And that regulated firm is normally going to be in one of the major financial services centers of the world, whether that be New York or London or Frankfurt or Paris or Tokyo or Sydney or wherever. And all of them will require that there be an audit, and the vast majority of those audits are undertaken by these large firms. They use this, therefore, as their basis of influence to create a leveraged opportunity for them to provide additional services. But it is, at the end of the day, a statutory right, which they have exploited. So this is really a rent-seeking activity. Next slide. Amongst the activities that they undertake, and the one for which perhaps I've done more work than anything else, is their role in tax havens. I mean, this is why I was involved in creating the Tax Justice Network, literally right at the beginning, why John Christensen and I were the two people who basically directed it for its first 7 or 8 years. I am now no longer involved in the Tax Justice Network at all. In fact, John and I have both been expelled by the Tax Justice Network because they no longer think that we are suitable people to be involved, which is quite an extraordinary situation. But let's also be honest, we don't think they're suitable people to be involved either. So there's a massive breakdown in what the Tax Justice Network does now. And I should mention that. But we started it with the intention of looking, of course, at what these firms did in tax havens. And we took them on very directly and very quickly. The piece of work I mentioned with Silas Stausholm, we looked at the role of these firms in tax havens. We used the term secrecy jurisdiction, which I basically created in 2008 when we were developing the first financial secrecy index at the Tax Justice Network. It still is being developed. It's the only index they produce which is of any real value. I would actually suggest you do not use any of the others if you're doing research, because they are deeply statistically flawed, which is fundamentally why we've fallen out, I guess. But the financial secrecy index does remain statistically appropriate. And we looked at the number of places where these firms are, and you will see how many locations they are in. Fundamentally, the world's tax haven or secrecy jurisdiction network could not function without the presence of the big 4 firms. I consider them to be the underpinning of the offshore world. There would be no offshore world without them. There is no commonality in the banks. Obviously, banks do exist around the world. And when you go to some of these tax havens, I'm not always very popular in them, so I don't go to as many as I might. But when you go to them, you will find there are familiar banks named there. But those banks do not operate in the way that the big 4 do in every major jurisdiction, and nor do the lawyers. The lawyers tend to operate in a fairly limited sphere. So those who work in the common law jurisdictions, those by and large under British prior influence or present influence, whichever way you look at it, those who work within other legal systems, and they tend not to overlap. But the big 4 are everywhere. And I think this is critical to the understanding of these firms, that they are the facilitators of the world of secrecy. And that opens up your mind as to what these firms really are. They are fundamentally there to increase the opportunity for profit to be made by multinational firms and those who own those firms in a way that is beyond scrutiny. And in fact, I think that is true of most of what they are about, including when it comes to accounting. So this is where I first became heavily involved John and I took on Jersey, we took on Guernsey, we took on the Isle of Man, and then we expanded our work. And we were pretty successful. I halved the government income of the Isle of Man with one piece of research. Jersey had to change a great many of its laws because of our opposition. They didn't like it, and these firms were at the core of that process. Can I just move on to the next slide? I don't want to make it too long. They're more dangerous, I now think, when it comes to accounting. I mean, and that's quite a claim when you think how dangerous I think they are with regard to tax. They are really the maintainers of what they see as the status quo. If you actually go back into the history of accounting, and it's certainly worth looking at the history of accounting, and a lot of that history, as far as the world is concerned, is developed in what is now the UK accounting market, simply because in the 19th century, the UK was leading the development of accounting. It was going on in the States, but a little lag at the time. You will find familiar names, people like Deloitte, people like Peat and Marwick. You will find elements of Price Waterhouse actually in the UK, but it was more a US orientated firm and so on. Arthur Young, where EY's Y comes from, was also an operator in the UK. They were the people who were actually creating the idea of what accounting was even back then. And accounting was literally around this idea that accounts are prepared to report to the shareholders of a company on what the management are doing, and that there is no other relevant user of accounting data. Now, that may have been pretty radical in 1860, when we began to see something like the modern concept of accounts begin to develop, with the predecessors of these firms actually being there and doing some of that work. But to pretend that that is still the purpose of accounting now is ludicrous. And yet in 2022, we still have accounts that are basically prepared for the suppliers of capital. And that idea is what underpins the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, which I see as a proxy agency for these four firms and their clients in maintaining this status quo, which is aligned against the interest of those who need to know what is happening inside the multinational corporation. The idea that these are microeconomic entities with no macroeconomic consequence is something that they persist in arguing, and it's obviously untrue. The fact is that most of the companies that these firms are auditing are macroeconomic entities. It's an idea that most people aren't used to, but because they're called public interest entities in the European Union, the very term public interest entity makes it clear they have a macro consequence of their micro behavior. And yet we are still being denied the right to have accounting data, which is supplied to us. And the most obvious example of this, well, there's two obvious examples. So the first one I would explain is the one for which I guess I'm perhaps in accounting terms best known, which is the creation of country-by-country reporting. Country-by-country reporting is a very simple tool. It involves this publication of just 7 pieces of data: external turnover, internal turnover, cost of labor, profit before tax, tax paid and tax accrued, and net asset investment in a jurisdiction. And based upon that, you can create formulas to basically do apportionment estimates of whether or not a company is over or under declaring profits in a jurisdiction in proportion to real levels of economic activity undertaken. Now, I created this idea in 2003. I was told by the Big Four very persistently and for a very long time that this was absolutely ludicrous, impossible. I couldn't ask a company to do this. They could never do it. They didn't know where the transactions of a multinational corporation might be located. Obviously false claims, but they aligned themselves heavily against this because it would, of course, severely restrict the opportunity for transfer pricing abuse. And they persisted with this until literally the argument was won at the OECD to have this created for tax purposes. The argument was won in 2014. It was delivered in 2015. On the afternoon, Pascal Saint-Amand retired from the OECD at the end of October. He sent me a note saying, thank you for delivering country-by-country reporting, which was very nice of him because it was one of the big achievements of his career at the OECD. It's why I ended up as a professor. But we were opposed all the way by the Big Four, every single step, including some very funny recordings of EY getting very angry with me at the OECD. So there is this real thing that they were opposed to disclosure for the public benefit. And they're doing exactly the same now with regard to climate change. Climate change is the biggest issue of our times. I mean, the other theme of my work over the last 20 years has been green issues. I co-created the Green New Deal. And so I've been heavily involved in green issues since 2008-7, really. And so there's that parallel theme. And I've created an accounting standard now for how to incorporate accounting into the audited financial statements. They are vehemently opposed to that. And the International Sustainability Standards Board, created by the IFRS, is the perfect example of their attempt to keep something of public interest out of statutory accounts. The sustainability reporting of multinational companies will not be on the balance sheet. This is quite ludicrous. What they want to maintain is the opportunity to exploit capital at cost to society at large, in my opinion. That is how I think they believe they service their clients. This is the rent extraction opportunity, and it's still going on. Let's have the next slide. There aren't many more, I think. What to do about this? And this is one of the things that you said I should talk about. And I've spent a long time talking about what the problem is. I think the answer to that is to challenge. And you have to be willing to take some abuse if you're going to challenge these firms. I did it. I still do it on tax havens, seeking to expose what they're doing. And obviously, that's why things like the Financial Secrecy Index came about. That's the basis of the work I did with Silas Stalzone. But I think the critical point is not just saying what they're doing. This point that I engage with here is offer alternatives is absolutely fundamental. I don't think the Financial Secrecy Index would have been a lot of use if we hadn't have had some very specific demands that flow from it, one of which was country-by-country reporting, which we've pretty much secured, but not in the public domain, except in Australia, where it's going to happen very soon. Full marks to Australia and the pressure from civil society there, which is delivering it. Automatic information exchange from tax havens, which I was told in June 2009 by the UK Treasury would not happen in my lifetime. Started in 2017. I'm still here. They got that forecast wrong in the UK Treasury, like most other things they forecast. And now things like sustainable cost accounting, actually saying you're wrong to say we can't put climate change on the balance sheet because I can show we can. And this is where I think we have to build alternative narratives, not just of what they're doing wrong, but what they could be doing right. So I'm particularly interested in the offering alternatives element of this. I think the next one is my final slide. Finally, and this I think is really key in the context of so much of what they do, the Big Four have really permeated the thinking of the world's governments, many of whom don't think they can move without asking a Big Four consultant to endorse what they do. Now, that, first of all, shows the weakness of so many modern politicians. They don't have confidence in themselves. But it also shows the power of the neoliberal thought that there is nothing that the government can do that the market couldn't do better, which is how I pretty much project that overall power. So the governments stand back and say, no, we must do what those in the market would do. How can we find out what those in the market would do? I know, let's ask the Big Four firms. Now, the fact is that I now believe there are very few answers to the questions that most governments are facing, which have a market-based solution. I mean, I happen to think that neoliberalism has run out of steam. I mean, isn't it obvious? There are no ideas left. Even the large companies, the tech companies who perhaps most exemplify the idea of neoliberalism alongside the banks, are very clearly literally out of ideas as to what to do. And yet they still go and ask the Big Four, what is the answer to the questions? I believe that's wrong. I think that what we actually need to do as campaigners is also say there are better songs to sing, there are better narratives to follow. But one of the jobs we have to do is actually therefore come up with ideas. And I do that sort of thing as well. I mean, this is a book I wrote some years ago. It's called The Courageous State. which isn't exactly something which most right-wingers think about, that there might be a courageous state which actually has the power to make decisions and take actions on behalf of society. But that's the sort of thing I think we need to address as well. So those are my themes. Sorry, I've spoken for probably slightly longer than 15, but I know we're one speaker down, so I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely okay. Thank you so much. As said before, I want to ask if there...
Thanks, Anna, for having me. Thanks, everyone, for attending. So, different from Richard, I'm not a accounting expert. I mean, I was a student of economics once, and I did some accounting, but I'm not an accounting expert. But I must say that as a former member of parliament, certainly I had a lot of contact with accounting firms, not always voluntarily, but it basically was a part of my political life. And certainly accounting is a tremendously necessary part of our economic life. So basically, when money is created in our economy, it involves accounting. So it's basically created by somebody pushing a button in a bank when they extend you a loan. And this is a mere accounting practice, which many people don't understand. So accounting is useful, can be socially useful in many ways. However, as Richard has presented so vividly, accounting firms command a lot of political and economic power, and that's what I'm going to try to allude to. So I first stumbled across this field when I entered European Parliament in 2014. I was sweet 34 back then, and I started to get to know Richard during that time, because there was the so-called Luxembourg Leaks scandal, which involved big corporate players basically using transfer pricing, which I will explain in a minute, to basically slash their tax bill to very often lower than 1% of their profits. And it was a big scandal also because back then it was at the height of the so-called Euro crisis. There was like austerity invoked in a lot of European countries. And Jean-Claude Juncker, the back then president of the European Commission, was the former prime minister of Luxembourg. So it had everything it needed for political scandal. And it fell to me, for some reasons I still don't understand retrospectively, to be part of that Luxembourg Leaks committee. I actually started the initiative with other parliamentarians to have a special investigative committee, and my own political career took a little bit off there because at one stage I could prove that Mr. Juncker had publicly lied to the parliament, namely to me, about a secret page from a report that was once created about the tax practices of Luxembourg. And I want to add that this whole issue of tax dodging is more complex than it is very often presented to us. So it's not a coincidence that a lot of small EU member states or overseas territories, former colonies, and so on, islands, do engage in tax dodging, because they argue, like, we don't have a car industry like in Germany. Their ability to conduct monetary policies and so on are limited in the Eurozone. So they very often engage in these kind of like beggar thy neighbor policies. And obviously the the accounting firms, the big advising firms, play a huge role in designing these tax schemes. So very often they went also to states that were politically dependent colonies for a long time, and they basically offered them to design and advise their tax policy so that they could attract some foreign investment, and then miraculously it would trickle down to people, which certainly it did not. But that's also like a critical role of those firms in basically establishing. So basically they they are part of, I would call it, privatizing lawmaking, or privatizing state authority as well to some extent. And what we overlooked in Luxembourg, which is certainly not a former Caribbean island, not a former colony or anything like that, but in Luxembourg, we had the so-called advanced pricing agreements, where basically they were intended to give companies a certain degree of legal certainty before they make certain investments and investment decisions. But in Luxembourg, it's spiraled out of control, because basically like PwC helped companies to have agreements with Luxembourg tax authorities how they would need to design certain investment choices in a way that they would end up with a very low tax bill. And the interesting part of it was that the Luxembourg tax authorities were very small and understaffed, but they had one person, very important person called Marius Kohl, who was like responsible basically for accepting those advanced pricing agreements. And by international standards, the responsibility of Luxembourg would have been to observe the so-called arm's length principle by the OECD. So the idea behind that is that a lot of multinational corporations would slash their tax bill by, for example, using their subsidiaries in other jurisdictions, to shift, like to pay, for example, artificial license fees, or to pay interest on intra-company loans to those territories. So, an example, Apple Germany selling iPhones in Germany, recording high profits, but they don't want to pay according to the German corporate tax rate, so they would take on a loan or pay an artificial license fee to, let's say, Apple Island. And by that they could shift profits from Germany to Ireland, as a very simple, just illustrative example. And when these advanced pricing agreements were conducted, actually they rubber stamped them all in such a multitude that it was not conceivable that they really checked whether they corresponded with the so-called arm's length principle. That means that OECD requires you to you can only use transfer prices. Let's say on such an artificial loan, the interest rate must correspond to what kind of interest rate you would pay if you were taken on a loan by a bank, which is unrelated to your own corporation, so by a third company. And the problem is, however, if you think about, let's say, the Apple iPhone and the value of its patent, it's very easy to manipulate these transfer prices, because you don't really have an objective standard very often according to which how to price these like intra-company license fees and so on. But what Luxembourg did is they didn't really control anything, they just rubber stamped it. And this involved PwC, because PwC actually, as we found out later, had the official letterhead of the Luxembourg state. So they basically had blank paper with the letterhead of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and they filled it out, and then they basically sent it over, and it just went through. So there was a cooperation basically of the Luxembourg state and PwC. So they outsourced basically their public authority to PwC. And that was the first time that basically I came across these big firms in my political career. And then some of the proposals certainly we tabled, some of the studies we did together with Richard were funded by my political group back then. And we lobbied for country-by-country reporting, because country-by-country reporting requiring corporations to publicly disclose for each country where they're economically active, turnover and profits and number of employees and key some of these key figures would help you identify that this like profit shifting takes place, because, for example, you could then detect that a company would be making very high turnovers and profits, let's say in Germany, but not paying effectively the taxes there. And so it was very important information. And when I was already in the German parliament, we were still fighting that battle very hardly, even with the current Chancellor of Germany, who was back then the Minister of Finance, until even in his party, pressure became so high that he finally stopped to block that proposal, because in Germany, there were a lot of concerns that this would expose the profits basically that the German export industry was making in countries such as China and India, and that it would basically open Pandora's box to have further transparency requirements there. Because it's very interesting that in Europe, we very frequently have a debate that we say we want, for example, for US tech companies to pay their fair share of tax in Europe. But we get very clumsy when it's about our own corporations being active in the global south or in China and India. So that was basically where the debate was in Germany. And then we also had a proposal which was linked to, because these like big consulting and auditing firms were so instrumental in designing and proposing new tax avoidance schemes. There was a law passed in response to EU regulation, which required them to notify tax authorities when they were designing new tax avoidance schemes for corporations, but only when it involved like cross-country activities. So, for example, in Germany, we had big tax scandals involving the so-called like cum-ex deals, where you would shift basically shares around in order for the state not to be able to identify who's the real owner of those shares. And by that, you could basically request reimbursement of capital gains tax more often than it was paid. It was like €1 billion scheme for German banks. And some of those deals involved only national-based schemes. They also became international, but some part of it was only national. And these kind of schemes would not have been required to register under this German law. So there is a requirement now in Germany that these big consulting and auditing firms register some like tax avoidance schemes, but it has loopholes, and it's sanctioned only. I think there was like sanctions can be invoked of up to 25,000 euros if you don't register like some of those schemes, but that's very little compared to the profits you can make actually with tax dodging for corporations. So that was one of the fields where I was active. And later on, my second rendezvous basically with these big consulting auditing firms. I mean, there are obviously some politicians who were constantly lobbied by them. I was not so much one of them. Firstly, because they knew that I'm not the right person to lobby for their interests, because I was giving them a hard time. So when I became more prominent because of my work, of my investigative work, they knew they had to deal with me sometimes because my voice was heard by like uncovering some of the things, like when I exposed Juncker and so on, when he had lied to the parliament. And that gave me some voice, and that's why they were very polite to me. They reached out to me sometimes, but obviously I was not the person they're like prime politician they would talk to when they were trying to influence legislation. They only came in the end of the process when they wanted to avoid maybe me being too critical in the public. Then they would reach out sometimes to me. the second time I came across them was during the so-called Wirecard scandal, which was a big thing in Germany. It involved a payment processing firm, Wirecard, that basically at the turn of the millennium made its profit in the early phase of the internet, when there was no Amazon, when like it was not easy to process payment in the internet yet, because like a homepage would take ages to build up, and all those issues involved. So they started to process payments in pornography and online gambling. And online gambling was seen as a high-risk field, especially by US authorities, for money laundering by organized crime and for terrorist financing, because you could easily manipulate turnovers. And so Wirecard became big with these like shady business practices, and later had this story that a lot of politicians in Germany believed that it would have turned from that, like doing that like kind of dirty business, into that big finance fintech firm, basically, that has these like super algorithms to better evaluate credit default risk and so on. And they were basically the German answer to Google. So it was presented. But it turned out that basically they were fraud, and they collapsed in 2020. So there were like 1.9 billion euros reported missing in their balance sheet, that they claimed that it had been on some special account on the Philippines that were never thoroughly audited. And the interesting part of it is there's a huge story around that that has to do with a fugitive Wirecard manager, Jan Marsalek, who had a lot of Secret Service connections, and there are a lot of rumors that maybe this, or there are a lot of indicators that this company effectively was shielded, but some of the also German security service establishment, because they were all doing all kind of shady business via this company. And that's an important part, actually, to understand that a lot of these shadow financial jurisdiction that Richard was talking about, these services are not only used in the corporate world, but they are also used in like for like geopolitical purposes and other purposes. And that's part of the reason why probably an ultimate transparency is even blocked on the political level sometimes. But apart from that aspect, which is very interesting to talk about, but not our concern here mainly, the interesting part of the Wirecard story was that EY had audited them and basically said that their books are all right for a number of years, despite alarming incidents of red flags. So I could see some of the documents that Wirecard had provided to them, and basically my 13-year-old son might have falsified some of these documents on an Atari computer. So it was so obvious that these documents were fraudulent, but EY nevertheless had audited them. And that led to a huge debate in Germany about how to regulate auditing firms, because in Germany, there is no true separation of auditing and consulting business, which is a big problem, because auditing was not so profitable for these big companies in Germany, but the consultant business was very, very profitable, and it was subsidized. So very often there was a conflict of interest involved, that maybe these big firms would audit companies and close both eyes on some holes in a balance sheet, because they would expect a lot of consultant business from those companies. That was not what happened so much in the case of Wirecard, but it was a big area of debate in Germany. And then the liability of these auditing firms was also very limited in Germany. And one argument taken like basically to oppose heightened liability for these companies was that, well, if we increase too much of their liability, I think it was limited to 4 million euros in Germany if you audited a member of the a company that was part of the German stock exchange, then this would lead to the big three, right? So they always quoted the case of Arthur Andersen in the United States and the Lehman bankruptcy, and they said, like, if you're too strict now, then you would see also EY basically going bankrupt, and then you would only have the big three, and then you would further strengthen their market power and concentration. That's why, well, I countered that argument basically also by tabling many proposals how you would involve even like small and medium-sized auditing firms in the auditing process by requirement. But a much bigger problem was, in my view, also that our German Financial Supervision Authority, which also protected and shielded Wirecard, had only 5 staff members with an auditing degree. So 5 times Richard, basically, to supervise the 4th largest economy in the world, you know, like all those activities over there. And there you can see that also there, a huge part of the problem was the privatization of lawmaking, but also law enforcement. I always say that's a little bit like similar to when the ADIC, which is the big automotive member club in Germany, Richard. So, and you know, the car is holy in Germany. So if you would say to the ADIC, can you do the alcohol testing after the Oktoberfest in Germany? You know, like it would create a kind of conflict of interest for sure. I rather have the police doing that. And so in Germany, part of the problem is that our financial supervision authorities were not really fit to purpose for that. They didn't have the right tools, and that was a deliberate political decision. And ironically, it was taken under a red-green government in the end of the 1990s. They decided to create a kind of public-private entity, a body, which was also had very few staff members, which could require, in some cases, companies to open their books. And we had a lot of crazy stories. So finally, Wirecard, it was discovered that Wirecard didn't have, after like a lot of critical Financial Times reports and so on, that Wirecard basically falsified some of its turnover and its profits. And that was discovered by KPMG, actually auditing them, and they said there's not sufficient proof for those turnovers. And there were all kind of wild stories involved. So, for example, it was claimed that when some of these third partner companies that worked with Wirecard, that were created to make it look as they were making big profits on some like foreign markets in Asia. So when finally they wanted to see the profits and really check whether 1.9 billion euros, which were the third of their balance sheet, is effectively there, they never checked it, EY, for many years. They never bought an airplane ticket to check in the Philippine banks. But when they said, when they finally did this, they were even Wirecard had organized fake employees to act as staff members of the bank. So it was really a big shit show going on over there. And interestingly, when KPMG went through their books, finally, they released a report. And we had a supervision authority called APAS, which was responsible for it was in charge of the supervision of auditing firms. And the head of the German supervisor of auditing firms had bought Wirecard stocks himself after the release of the KPMG report. And he had said that he had not acted on the auditing firms because he wanted to wait for that result by KPMG. Then he claimed he had read those results and he had understood them. They were damaging for Wirecard, but he still bought Wirecard shares afterwards. So this is how crazy it was in Germany, and it just gives you some of the ideas that how dependent our own supervision authorities and lawmakers became on these entities. But it is also an indicator that in the case of Wirecard, they probably thought this company is bulletproof because it had some level of state support. And but that's an issue that is separate from our today's discussion. So basically, there were some reforms after that scandal on the auditing industry. So like their liability was slightly increased, but yet a lot of the small-scale investors will probably not be able to pursue EY for their losses and for the damages. And we still have EY being big in business, and that's where I want to end. Because interestingly, when the Corona pandemic broke out, we had a huge disaster in Germany because we didn't have a national reserves of protective masks. And that was due to, let's say, the whole neoliberal outlook of trimming down the state. So we didn't have the reserve. And what happened is then that we needed to quickly buy masks from everywhere, which became a big financing scheme for some of my former colleagues, some of them being highly corrupt, who made like millions by reaching out to our minister, back then Minister of Health, and brokering some deals so that they would dig up some companies in China that would deliver these masks that sometimes had not the required quality, and then they would pay very expensive prices for these masks, and they would cash in and take a commission. So some members of parliaments were involved in these deals and had to step back. So that was a big scandal. But there's a big scandal behind that scandal, because after that chaos had broken out, Jens Spahn, the former minister of health in Germany, actually tasked EY, the very company that was involved in all these fraudulent activities with Wirecard, to sort out that chaos. Again, because there were a lot of lawsuits involved in companies that had then delivered masks and that they wanted to charge the government and said, like, we delivered, but you didn't pay us, and so on. And so even that chaos was managed by EY, and they made millions out of managing this chaos. So why am I saying that? Because I think it is structural by design. So companies such as EY benefit from the lack of state capacity in managing the crisis of our times. And I think that the Corona crisis and the way it was managed is indicative of basically we needed something like maybe a war-style economy where we would like produce those masks and so on. But this didn't happen because very often the state has become incapable by design to manage these crises. And that's where these companies come in. And a lot of them design laws in Germany where there's a massive conflict of interest involved. And what I did in my time in parliament was to try to get information about in which laws were they involved. But it's very hard to obtain that information because very often the German government would hide behind company secret and all of those issues. So let me stop here because I see I spoke very, very too long. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, I hope we can have some further discussion on the topics raised. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much.